yes, I think they are, but I also think that a ruling elite that is increasingly disconnected from its own people doesn't really understand what's driving high levels of frustration. The people voted for a particular outcome, and although the result was close, a referendum was held. Quite frankly, I think most people that would wish to remain think that perhaps a referendum should never have been held, but the reality is it was held. And the frustration on both sides of that debate is increasingly palpable, as Britain sort of seems to be crashing towards either another vote, a simple exit, a no deal, or going towards another referendum, which if Britain does end up in another referendum, is quite likely to involve a high degree of violence, quite frankly, because there is so much at stake and some people feel so cheated. But equally, that frustration we saw in France coming to a head very quickly, without the kind of structural and organised chaos that has been taking place in the UK or the US. In many ways, people that I've been talking to suggest that it's sort of returning to 1968 France. But my great concern, in fact, as you mentioned earlier, is that in reality, this is a return to the 1930s. In economics, there's a big debate by people like Paul Mason about whether we're seeing another so-called Kondiev wave where capitalism goes through a structural change rather than simply a cyclical change, and such is so dislocating that it's driving this process and this anger and resentment that is being manifested through ever-growing violence in protests. It's not clear where this will end, but one thing we do know is that the continuing absence of leadership throughout the world is going to create significant problems if it continues.
Yeah. I would add just that I think in terms of polarization and protest, Brexit was polarized. I mean, well, I'm not saying anything new, but it was from the beginning. I mean, if you talk to most people, it was clearly for Brexit or clearly for Remain. There was not that much space for actual critical discussion. But I think going to protest, and perhaps you have the more scientific vocabulary to explain this, but I think definitely once people are out on the streets, that makes them more committed to the cause. Because of the language I use, it would be because of the effective bonds that occur and effective responses that people have to others, the collective identity that is strengthened when people go to the streets. So they're more likely to protest again once they've taken that first step to go out on the streets.
Yeah, and I think also that what we need to always remember is that the Brexit referendum was designed to be polarising. That is how these kind of, charismatic populist moves work. It was a very, very populist move designed to gain a lot of the UKIP vote for the Tory party. And David Cameron was making a very charismatic move to say yes, no. It was an irrational choice because these things are obviously very complex. And the voter was not given that kind of complex overview of what leaving the EU would mean. And because of that strategic requirement to polarise, that this is what has driven a lot of the malcontent. In designing the Brexit referendum, it was important for the people that developed it to try and instill a sense of fear and anger in order to push themselves towards that vote. That came with a lot of necessary, sadly, propaganda based at the usual kind of subgroups such as immigrants. And that led ultimately to a lot of hostility. And we've seen a lot of campaign violations that have been found by Electoral Commission and, Vote Leave or the Leave campaigns, overspent by a great deal of money. And a lot of that money went into right-wing propaganda-based online social media, micro-targeted campaigns designed to polarise. So a lot of this polarisation, it's not organic. It has been very well stage managed, and we do need to remember that. Theresa May said that she wasn't going to take notice of that, but I think definitely there has been a change in the way that Leave and Remain has been discussed by the political class. I think there's a temporal dimension to it where we say, has it had an immediate effect? We can't say, but is it going to have a longer term effect like you were discussing earlier? I think that temporal dimension is very interesting because it looks like it has a little bit more of a slow burn effect, that it will change the way that the discussion is being held in Westminster, although we do seem to have a lot of political paralysis there, obviously, which, as you say, also the ruling political class don't seem to have an ability to really connect with the people and what they want, and that's driving that polarisation even further.
Yeah, it's interesting. In 1990, there was an article in The Atlantic by John Mearsheimer called Back to the Future. And he wrote about how, while everybody else was excited about the peace dividend, there were three likely outcomes in the future. One would be the world would plunge into recession. Two, there'd be an absence of leadership in Europe. And three, America would retreat into isolationism, and the consequences, he said, were very predictable. We saw this in the 1930s. And what was interesting about the campaign in Brexit was, in the absence of that leadership, on the back of a recession, and with an American leader clearly retreating into isolation, what the Brexit Party tried to do was quite explicitly, and frankly quite openly, not try to talk about the facts, but frame the vocabulary. And they were highly effective at doing that. I mean, if we talk about free movement and we talk about immigration, these are broadly speaking the same things, but clearly the impact is quite different in the way you think about them. And their ability to do this was also learnt from the Trump campaign through similar advisory firms. This ability to frame the nature of the political debate has had huge consequences. And as we go forward in, frankly, a state of chaos, as nobody in the British political elite seems to know how to react, is creating a very dangerous vacuum, because that vocabulary inevitably will become more strident. And once Farage and people on that side of the argument are able to control that framing, that creates a high potential for conflict.